And joining me today as co-hosts are from Sheffield Gothic, Lauren Nixon and Mary Going. Welcome, Lauren and Mary.
Hi, nice to be back.
Very nice to be back.
Good. I'm glad you came back. So, on that, like, will they come again? Yes, they came again. So thank you. And joining us today as a special guest is a Gwendolyn Keist. Did I say it right? Is it Keist?
You did. You said it right.
Hey, I finally said it right. Gwendolyn corrected me the other day after I had already prepped her, like previewed her multiple times saying it the wrong way. But Gwendolyn Keist is the author of the short story, The 8 People Who Murdered Me, an excerpt from Lucy Westenra's diary, which won a Bram Stoker Award from the Horror Writers Association just this year. And she also won another one this year for an essay on Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
Perkins Gilman, yes.
Yeah, yes. And then she won a Stoker last year. She's winning, like she's won all the Stokers. They're gonna cap her soon. You can read her story, The 8 People Who Murdered Me, at Nightmare Magazine. Keist is also the author of the novels The Rust Maidens and Her Smile Will Untether the Universe. Oh my God, I love that title. Now I have to read that one now. And several more novellas and stories. You can check her out at her website, which we'll share in the chat. It's GwendolynKiss.com. GwendolynKeist.com. Gwendolyn, welcome to Sundays with Dracula.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Excellent. So we're going to talk about your story in a little bit. We're going to talk about your interest in horror and vampires. And then you are going to stick around for a dissection of Chapter 8, which is all about Lucy, or half of it, or like 2/3 of it.
Yeah, most of it, yeah.
That's excellent. So I'm really interested in your take on this chapter. So as if I didn't know by your story, which is so beautiful and so moving, and I can't wait to talk. I can't wait to hear you talk about it, because what we do here on Sundays with Dracula is dissect, annotate, anatomize Bram Stoker's novel about bloodsuckers in the 1890s. One chapter at a time for 27 weeks. I have a co-host or two each week, and we create a kind of conversational annotation of the novel, one chapter at a time. Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula are one of the gems of the Rosenbach's collections, and while we're closed for quarantine, you can go online, you can see some of our collections guides, which we're putting together. We have gallery gateways for some of the exhibitions that we've run recently. We have other virtual programs and courses that we are creating. I just put together 4 courses. One is Black Women Writing, African-American Short Stories from the 19th century to the present day. There's a Harry Potter course, Hogwarts online, Harry Potter and the Social Distance course, something like that. I can't even remember the whole title. It's so big and it's so awesome. And people get to read a Harry Potter novel per month for 8 months. There's an introductory month in there. I know there's only 7 novels. There's a Ulysses Online course, Learning Ulysses Online, and there's an African-American detective fiction course, which will start in August. Lots of fun stuff. Sundays with Dracula is free to you from the Rosenbach, but of course, it does cost us money to create and operate shows like this. So if you'd like to make a donation or become a member, then you know what happens? I get to keep making awesome shows like Sundays with Dracula. So go to our website, click on the support tab, and honestly, it really is true. Any amount helps. Another tip about using chat, when you guys use chat today, make sure you put it on all panelists and attendees so you can talk amongst yourself. I mean, the live chat during the shows is absolutely spectacular. And if you want to ask questions, though, of any of the hosts, or if you want to ask Gwendolyn a question, put that in the Q&A. That's a lot easier for me to manage during the show, is managing the Q&A for questions from you. So, Mary and Lauren first, what's new with you guys?
What is new? Time just bleeds into one at the moment. It doesn't feel like 5 weeks since we were here last time.
I've noticed you have more shows up, and I haven't gotten to watch them because I'm busy. But I'm looking forward. There's an interview with each of you on your Sheffield Gothic.
There is. Yeah.
What is it called? Are we calling it a podcast? What are we calling it?
We're calling it Conversations with Sheffield Gothic, which is a very inventive title that we came up with.
And you can find it on YouTube, right?
Yes, you can find us on YouTube. If you search Sheffield Gothic, we'll come up. So yeah, Mary and I, not at all awkwardly, interviewed one another as if we haven't known each other for 6 years. And so if you want to know any more about us, we talk about our research, how we got into academia, why we study the Gothic, and just a little bit about who we are and what we do. And then we just put up our top vampire picks. So we each discussed our top 3 vampires.
And I didn't. I'm sorry. That would have been a great thing for today to go into. So.
Well, I think my top picks were potentially not as Gothic as they could have been. But we tried to pick some diverse ones. We kept Draculas out of it. We decided that Draculas are their own category of vampire, and if we included Draculas in the list, then it would really complicate things.
So you chose was it a specific vampire from a book or a movie that you chose? Okay.
Yeah, so I picked one from a online D&D role-playing game, one from a children's cartoon, and one from a novel. So I had a pretty diverse pick.
Should we not give them away? So yeah, don't give them away so people have to
Yeah, you have to go and watch the video. I'm not telling you who they are.
So to find out what they are. But,
yeah, you have to go and watch.
Excellent. Mary, how have you been?
Yeah, good. Myself and Lauren have been marking. So we've just finished all of our kind of teaching classes and marking. So now the summer can begin, and we're still in quarantine.
Yeah, for what it's going to be. So.
Yeah. But yeah, we've got the vampire video that came out last week, and then it's also coming up to the year anniversary of the conference that I organised, or I helped to organise, Buffy and the Bible. So we're hoping to have a special video with myself and some of the organisers and the conference artists that we had. So hopefully around 4th of July, something Buffy will be up as well on the channel. So yeah.
Cool. All righty. Well, I'm so glad you guys are back. People have been asking for you too. So.
Oh, that's very kind.
Yeah. So especially last week when we had Grady Hendrix, who was fabulous. I mean, he's really good. And but again, it was like 3 guys talking about Dracula. So, that can, I think for some people get kind of old. So it gets old for me. So I'm happy to have you guys here to make a great show. And Gwendolyn, what a treat for us today to have you on this show. Your connection is working very well. That's good.
Yay! That was like
the other day, and it wasn't working. So it works for the show. That's all that counts. Your story, 8 People Who Murdered Me, the excerpt from Lucy Westenra's diary, absolutely wonderful. I really loved it. I was reading again this morning, and I was like, I was getting all emotional in it and all. I mean, it's that well done. So I'm really happy that you wrote it. So thank you for writing it.
Thank you.
And tell us a little bit about how you came up with that story and how you put it together.
Obviously, I think like so many of us here on this panel and probably watching this, I grew up with Dracula. I think my first exposure was the Bela Lugosi film, but my parents both loved the novel, and so I was very aware of it. I don't actually remember a time of not being aware of Dracula. There was no like moment of that I remember discovering. It was sort of always there. Mm-hmm. And then I remember I was fairly young, probably too young to watch it now thinking back, but I saw Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Coppola movie, and I loved Sadie Frost as Lucy, but I felt like she was so underused. And even though I know a lot of people love Gary Oldman as Dracula, he's not my favorite Dracula. And I felt like once Sadie Frost wasn't in it anymore as Lucy, I was like, this isn't any fun anymore. And that stuck with me from the time I was a kid. And I would always go back and I would always look at, how Lucy was being portrayed in the different movies and go back to the book. And I'm always like, I want to know more about her. Like, this is a character I just feel like, there's so much potential here and we don't really get a lot from her perspective. It's everybody watching her and talking about her. And so then I was just one day, I was like, well, why don't I go and write it? It's in public domain. Like, I'm a writer. This is what I do. So I'm like, all right. It actually took me a long time. This is the longest short story that I've ever worked on. It took about 2 years to finish it, because I just kept going back to it, and I really wanted to do the character justice because I loved her so much. And so, yeah, so it was a long gestation period, because I've always loved the story of Dracula, and I've always loved this character.
Do you think then all these different Lucys that you saw and really kind of influence? I mean, did you pull any particular Lucy into your story? Something you saw in a movie or read somewhere?
I actually tried to pull a little bit from like a lot of things and just how they kind of affected me growing up. So not so much like, oh, let's actually put Sadie Frost in here, or let's put, Horror of Dracula's Lucy in here. It was more just like the feel of all of those and trying to get kind of the different, I love Hammer films, and I love how gothic they are, and very, I don't want to say cheesy because that sounds terrible, but if I do say cheesy, I'm saying it in a loving way. I love that they look like sets. I actually think that that's so beautiful. So when I was writing this, I'm like, have a little bit of that, and have these little moments that it's like, you could almost imagine it as being this kind of like movie set at these moments, very stylized. And so kind of pulling more of the feel of the different versions that I've seen, and obviously going back to the original story, and then trying to put something kind of obviously of my own in there as well, so that it's not just completely pastiche.
Did you also think about the way women, I'm not even gonna ask questions. Lauren, Mary, why should I ask all the questions? Like, I have a list of questions, and like I'm just in that mode, like ask your questions, and I shouldn't though. So, Mary, Lauren, what do you think?
I think it's really interesting. We do this all the time. We start talking at the same time. It's the downside of working together for so long. I think it's really interesting what you just said about the Hammer horror sets, because I think that's something that I have such an issue with sometimes in Dracula adaptations, is that they take it too seriously.
Yes.
And I really like that you don't do that, that you kind of tread that line between, the campness of Dracula and of the gothic, and the terror and the horror and the injustice that's done to Lucy. I love Lucy. She's one of my favorite characters. I feel very much the same. The minute she's gone, I'm like, well, I'm not interested anymore. But I really like how you tread that line. I don't know, I don't really have a question about it. I just need to say that I really appreciate that, because it's one of the things I've lamented many times, that Dracula adaptation to take themselves far too seriously.
I completely
and I feel like something's lost.
It's true. I completely agree. And that's something like my husband and I talk about a lot, because he's a huge horror fan as well. And he's always like, anytime there's a real self-serious Dracula, he's like, I'm out. I have no interest in this. It's not fun. And I think that there is something really fun even about the original story, even though it's dark. And like going back, and I obviously reread this chapter for today. I was just rereading yesterday. It's so much darker than I remember, even though I feel like they can pull all the camp elements out of it. But I think that that's maybe the mistake that some people make, that if it's a little bit campy, it can't be scary or creepy or unsettling. It absolutely can be. I mean, I feel like looking at those Hammer movies, they're very unsettling at points. They're genuinely scary, but they're also campy, and that makes them fun. And it's like the best of all worlds. And the real self-serious Draculas I've never felt were scary. I'm always just like, oh, here we go again. So it's like, I feel like that camp is kind of part of it. So I love that you brought that up. That makes me so happy to know I'm not the only one.
No, it's the thing that really stands out for me. And I think it's the thing that I kind of, if I was directing, that would be the thing that I would be insisting on. And anytime I see someone kind of pick up on that, I'm like, yes, you're on my team. I like this. Mary?
I echo all of what Lauren has said, of course. I think that's the thing about Gothic, is that it has to be camp. If it's not camp, then what's the point? Yeah, I really enjoyed your story, and surprising no one, it really reminded me of Buffy. So there's a line that you say,
pick off the bingo card.
Yeah. But a line that you say about Lucy, death is my birthright, and it just reminds me of that bit in Buffy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Death is a gift.
Yeah.
And it's very much a kind of a female thing, I think, that's missing from a lot of male kind of Dracula vampires that you do get with someone like Lucy, where there is this association with both creation and death. And then I also really like the bit at the end where you don't go there, but there's that kind of threat that Lucy will Lucy will be there at the count, watching over his kind of pile of ashes, waiting for him to come back. And that's a scene in Buffy versus Dracula. And
I haven't seen that episode in forever, but yeah, I saw it years ago. Yeah.
And he starts to rematerialize, and she says, "I've seen your movies. I know what you're gonna do." But that kind of that playfulness that you get, that's very campy. So yeah, that's what I thought when I was reading it. I thought it was great.
Thank you. I was a huge Buffy fan. I haven't watched it for years at this point, but I mean, yeah, definitely as a teenager, it was like my go-to. So there's probably, whether I know it or not, there's probably some Buffy influence still there. Like I said, I haven't seen that Dracula versus Buffy episode in probably more than 10 years, maybe even longer, but I imagine there's definitely still some influence there. So I like that.
Yeah,
we're going through that here at home. My 15-year-old decided to get into Buffy this year, which was the greatest thing in the world, because she's the only one of my 5 daughters who have said, like, yeah, I want to watch something that's kind of horror. I shouldn't say kind of horror, it is horror, but it's done in a different way, so she could get into it. And but no, I'm going to ask her specifically about that episode now, so we can have the good talk about that. But she's actually she just finished 6, and she's so disappointed with 7 as she started it that she might not even finish it. She's really disappointed with 7, so season 7. So anyway,
she should push through, because season 7 towards the end, it's really great, and it's very
season 7 is so good.
Good, I'll tell her that. So maybe we'll have a special episode. We'll just talk about Buffy, and
yeah, let's do that.
Bring my kids in here, and we can have fun with that. In your story, Gwendolyn, of the people that who she blames for murdering her, in a sense, and she starts with herself, and then she gets into her mother, and there's a fascinating. I love how you kind of. I mean, there's a lot of emotion in it. Like I really feel for Lucy in this, and it's all the things that either we overlook in the text about her, or that we overlook, I think, in general about, women in horror, especially victims, and or treat them as victims all the time. And I love the way you kind of go into, she's even talking about her mother, and there's a fascinating little piece that Stoker cut out of his typescript. I don't know if you're aware of this. There's a typescript for the novel. There's no manuscript. What the Rosenbach has are notes that are just scattered all different kinds of things. And there was obviously a manuscript at one point, but then he had it typed up and then made corrections on the typescript. And the typescript's in a collection out on the West Coast, but he crossed out things in it. And one of the things he crosses out was from chapter 5, and it's from Lucy in her letter. And at one point, and I shared this, I think, on one of the other episodes, but she says that he cut. She's talking about her Homewood and Mama get along well together, and then what he cut out was, I almost envy Mother sometimes for her knowledge when she can talk to people, whilst I have to sit by like a dumb animal and smile a stereotyped smile till I find myself blushing at being an incarnate lie. And it is so silly and childish to blush, and without reason too, that he had originally envisioned a Lucy who was very self-aware of the way she was supposed to behave, and it was an incarnate lie is what she thought about it. And but he cut it out, and it's of the things that cut out, that strikes me as such a moment where he could have let her have more agency or more thought about what she has to go through. And I think you captured it, like, without even knowing that.
Yeah, I didn't even know that, but that's very much the spirit of the Lucy I was writing about. So that's great to know, because I did feel like a lot of even the things I was writing about, that this is still that Lucy. This is not like some completely different, some reimaginings are a completely different version than the original. What I was trying to do was still be able to stick at least somewhat close to the original. So it's interesting that I was picking up on subtext that was very much there and almost actually made it in as straight text. So that's interesting to hear. It's a beautiful line. Why did he cut that?
Yeah, I guess you can't keep them all in. So.
I guess.
But that one makes me really suspect. as to his own kind of maybe unconscious or maybe conscious motives of how he wants to portray his women in his book. So, you also write other horror, and what do you find about horror and because I think you told me too, you pretty much only write horror, right?
Mostly, yeah. I mean, I've written some fantasy and science fiction, but I mean, it's mostly all horror and dark fantasy, pretty much everything that I write. So yeah, like I said, I grew up on it. Both my parents are horror fans, and we just always loved horror. I always say my parents got married on Halloween back in the day when nobody was doing it, back in like the early 80s. And, you know, it's always been there, and horror's always just been so much fun. I always say it's like going home to me. It's very comforting, and I just love it. I love it so much. So it just seemed like a natural thing to get into the genre. So.
Was the Dracula film your first Dracula, or did you read Dracula first?
No, I definitely saw the Bela Lugosi film. I probably saw the Bela Lugosi Universal version when I was about 3 or 4. I mean, like I said, I can't remember. And I remember watching the end of Horror of Dracula before I saw the whole thing, because like I would be playing like with my toys somewhere, and my dad would be like, he'd always call me kid, and he'd be like, kid, come in here, I gotta show you something, hurry up, he's about to jump on the curtains, and like, you know, so I had to come in, and I remember seeing that end of Horror of Dracula with the candlesticks and pulling down the curtain, and it's great. I was just watching that again on YouTube, just some endings of Hammer films, and I'm like, it's still great, it's so much fun. And so yeah, so it was like there was always some kind of Dracula or some kind of horror in the background. So yeah.
Gatiss and Moffat put it in the new one, so it's a great touch that they add that. You know, well, they add bits of every single Dracula movie ever made, or within that series. They nod to that as well. Do you have a favorite vampire story, fiction, or film?
I mean, probably Horror of Dracula. I mean, you know, and probably Dracula. I mean, there's lots of great vampires, like you guys were saying, but I mean, I do love Dracula. If not Dracula, maybe Spike from Buffy. You've got me thinking about Buffy now. I don't always think about Buffy anymore, but now, of course, I am. I've been primed. Leading the witness. You're leading the witness. Spike, I like Spike.
Yeah, we a few weeks ago we did a Twitter poll over a week, and we had I think 32 vampire choices, and it was to decide like the ultimate vampire champion. Again, we didn't include Dracula because that's a whole other thing, but Spike ended up being the ultimate vampire champion. So yeah, good choice.
I was surprised at that. And so is that an age thing? Is it like, I was like, well, he's not going to win. It's going to be one of these others.
I did wonder if maybe it was the categorizing, because we started them out in like the groups of their novels. But Nadia from What We Do in the Shadows was a strong contender.
Yeah.
But I think people just were like, you know, I think they were thinking back to their teen years, and they were like, I gotta go for Spike between the two of them.
Yeah, when I chose the vampires, I was kind of coming off the end of being really ill, and it was, I think I was just like 4 from Buffy, 4 from the Vampire Diaries, 4 from What We Do in the Shadows, and yeah, it ended up weighted.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if people want to see that, you can go onto the Sheffield Gothic website, and it is there. And you can argue over that yourselves. Somebody has asked me what I'm drinking today. What are you guys drinking? Do you have your tea over in England?
Yes. Again? So it's still very humid. So I have peach soda iced tea with lemonade.
Lovely looking. So nice shade of red there.
Yeah, it's nice. It's very appropriately coloured.
Mary, you drinking tea?
Yeah, I still have hot tea, but in a witch mug this time.
No cocktails? No cocktails today for you, Gwendolyn?
No, I'm just drinking a bottle of water. I'm like boring. You guys have like exciting things going on. I'm like, I've got water.
No. Well, Annie just asking the questions what I'm drinking, and today it is gin, Galliano red, and I tried to do a red wine float. I fail at it every time I try to do a red wine float, where it's just the red wine on top and it just all went to the bottom. So, but it's, and I'm calling it Dracula's Bitter Kiss. So because the Galliano is a you know, a bitter aperitivo, so it's quite lovely. So
You're gonna have to make a recipe for a couple of these.
I know. I keep saying that. Somebody said we should do a book, so I'm gonna see if I can convince Josh O'Neill, one of my co-hosts, to do a Dracula Sundays with Dracula cocktail book. So that would be fun. I have a couple revenants here. The revenants part of this program are things that are still haunting me after we've already staked the previous episode, and I'm trying to gather my notes for the new one, so I come across these things. And sometimes I just pull them from chat too. And Laka Heiss in the chat for chapter 6 mentioned that, because we were talking about Lucy sleepwalking, and he mentioned that John Polidori, who wrote the first, you know, vampire story in English fiction, was the Doctor also traveled with Byron and Shelley. He did his doctoral dissertation on, of all things, somnambulism. And he wrote, Locke writes, I do think this is a complete but fascinating coincidence to the text we are talking about. And Polidori is also the youngest. At the time, he was the youngest person to ever graduate from Edinburgh's medical school, and this was an interest of his, and he wrote it in his other novel. I'm trying to think of the name of it. Ernestus Berchtold, something like that, was his other novel that he had written. I mean, he died very young. Was he 22 something when he committed suicide?
The thing I always remember about Polidori is his like half Italian heritage.
Yeah. And he's actually the uncle of Gabriel Rossetti, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. But what the question that he asked, he mentions at the end there, it's a quick coincidence. And in a sense, I wonder, well, is it a coincidence in a sense? Because sleepwalking and horror, there seems to be a lot of this. I wanted to put that question to you guys. What do you think about how often, let's start with Gwendolyn, is this something that you've seen, sleepwalking, come up in horror, gothic frequently, and why do you think that is?
Broadly, I would say I think sleep in general is terrifying. I've felt that way ever since I was a kid. It's this really strange thing. We all do it. We're still not completely sure why exactly. We don't really know what happens. And, you know, you can map the brain for what it's doing, but there's still a mystery to sleep. And there definitely was back, you know, in you know, when they're writing, you know, a lot of this Gothic literature. I mean, we don't know that much more about it now, but I just find sleep terrifying in general. I've felt that way since I was a kid. I would freak out as a kid. I'm like, why do we sleep? Why am I can't do this. What is this? And still even now to this day, sometimes I'm like, sleep is weird. And there's that line, is it Poe, like little slices of death, how I loathe thee? Is that a Poe quote? My dad, I think, is watching this, and if it's not a Poe quote, he's going to be
angry. Yeah, I don't think it is, but
there's some quote that's something about like they're like little slices of death, and I'm like, yes, sleep is like slices of death.
Somebody on the chat will tell us.
Yeah,
so, someone on the chat, put it in the Q&A.
There is a quote somewhere that is something like that.
That doesn't ring a bell for me. So the Poe questions I usually get right. So
but, somebody had a quote like that at some point. It's not me. I'm quoting someone else, but I agree with it, and I do think there is something with
great authors steal well, so don't worry about it. If you just want to steal that, go for it.
And nightmares, like I think also with sleepwalking, it's like a waking nightmare almost, even though you're still asleep, but you're moving around. And there's also the idea of, I feel like sleep, if it's terrible, yeah, I think sleep is the little death. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's the quote. But yeah, so I just think it's very creepy.
Google says it's Poe.
Yes! See? Little slices of death. How I love it. I almost got that word.
What is that from? Although Adam P, you know, misspells Alan there.
Oh, there's my dad. He's saying it is Poe. That's my dad. He's watching.
There you go. Thank you. There's nothing more wonderful than discovering there's another little bit of Poe that I didn't realize or that I didn't know was there. So that's great. Mary, Lauren, sleepwalking, Gothic tradition. Is this something that is there, or do I just think that it's there?
No, it's there. Particularly 19th century fiction. Somnambulism and mesmerism is a really big thing. And the 19th century Gothic really gets into the kind of nitty-gritty of anxieties about medicine and about the mind, the body, and what one is capable of or can do whilst sleeping or unconscious. And there's lots of, even when things like the Isle of Dr. Moreau, like Jekyll and Hyde, Carmilla, you know, there's elements of sleep and nightmare, it becomes a really big thing. Wilkie Collins does it in The Woman in White, that kind of like, is someone sleepwalking? Are they awake? Are they conscious? And it kind of treads that boundary between often, you know, did you see something or did you not see something? Are you conscious? Are you not conscious? That kind of anxiety really starts to come up in 19th century Gothic. And, you know, it's very fascinated with, particularly mesmerism is a really big part of that kind of mid to late 19th century Gothic. But somnambulism kind of leads into that. The idea of the semi-conscious, the subconscious, the unconscious. And obviously kind of early 20th century, you got a lot of Freudian readings of that, which is something we're trying to move away from in general, is Freudian readings of anything in academia. We're kind of trying to put that to the side. But yeah, someone just mentioned Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. That's a really, really good example. You get it a lot in that kind of woman in white trope, not just talking about the Wilkie Collins novel. Yeah, right through to kind of the early 20th century, I think. Does it feature in The Blood of the Vampire, Mary?
Oh, I can't remember.
Or is she just kind of not fully conscious in that? I can't remember if she sleepwalks or if it's just that she's not always aware of what she's doing.
In which?
So The Blood of the Vampire,
yeah.
by Florence Marriott, published same year as Dracula, has a female vampire. I think that's more of a kind of psychic vampirism, as opposed to something to do with sleep. But there is still that connection with something to do with, you know, the unseen and the unconscious, and something that we may or may not be aware of. But I'm not sure
that
about
kind of connection between somnambulism and mesmerism, that like the vampire is capable of mesmerism, and one of the symptoms of mesmerism seems to be somnambulism, sleepwalking, waking, lucid dreaming, that kind of thing. And obviously it's interesting, you have it here, you've got an asylum, you know, you're getting a rise of you know, I hesitate to call it psychiatry, but what will become psychiatry. And people are really interested in, you know, things like phrenology and things like blood disorders and disorders of the mind and hysterias and wandering wounds and things like that. And it does definitely becomes a really major part. There is some really good stuff in the last maybe 4 or 5 years that's come out about some really good academic stuff. I don't know if there's anything particularly about somnambulism, but definitely about mesmerism. If anyone's interested, the Victoria Popular Fiction Association always does really good reviews of kind of interesting and a little bit more off-the-cuff academic work that's being done. So if you are interested in reading something kind of academic about that, check out their website, because they will definitely have reviews and they can guide you on what the best type of thing to read is.
It is interesting that they do get intertwined, somnambulism and mesmerism, because it's that trance state. It's that someone is in a trance state that they're not actually consciously awake. And somebody, Jennifer Peters, reminded me that Charles Brockton Brown, the great, you know, inventor of American Gothic, so to speak, has a great story called Somnambulism, and it features in Weiland too, or is it Edgar Huntley? I can't remember. It features in one of his other stories as well, one of his other novels. I hate to say it, but the Little Slices of Death. I quick did a little search here while you were talking, and it's not Poe. It is one of those. It's one of those quotes that gets attributed to Poe online, and it's like everywhere. Because so once that's why someone said according to Google, because that's what it is. It's according to Google, and you can find those. There's a few different places online.
There are some odd ones, that like you think are from something and everybody says that they are, but it's like apocryphal.
And I usually, and that's why. Yeah, and that's why I doubted it, because I tend to have an ear for these quotes from Poe that, like, I'm talking about myself, like, oh, I'm so great, like, but I've read a lot of Poe, done a lot of Poe work, and so when those they're like too. It's like it's too good to be true, is what it sounds like. Somebody did have a question that I went over about your story, Gwen. I thought I'd ask that before we jump into the chapter. In that, since this is from Lee. Lee asks, since writing the story, have you thought of a ninth person that murdered Lucy? And I just want to expand a little more. Were there other ideas that you could have put in there?
I don't think so, because I mean, I covered almost every character that's even in the book, other than maybe Renfield, which I'm sad about. But Renfield and Lucy don't really have much interaction, if at all. I don't think they have any interaction in the book. So it was like, there was no way, even though he's my second favorite character in the book after Lucy. But like, no, I think I covered everybody, and I felt like I'm good with that. That's
they almost met because that was in the notes. It's Mina's not really her. It's Lucy who's engaged to Seward. So all through the notes for the outlines for the chapters, it's Lucy going to the asylum, Lucy meeting Renfield. So Lucy going to the blood room, which we don't get. I still can't believe he cut the blood room out of the novel. And speaking of Polidori, I should have mentioned the Rosenbach also has first edition of Polidori's The Vampire, first British edition. We also have first American edition of that, which is this really tiny little pamphlet that says The Vampire by Lord Byron. And as everybody thought at the time, everybody wanted it to be by Byron, and much to Byron's annoyance. So no, it's not by Byron, it's about Byron. So before we just reminder everybody, next week we have another special guest. We have Leslie Klinger, who is the editor, author of the annotated Dracula, one of the many annotated editions out there that a lot of people use. Les will be here next week's show, and our co-host will be Josh O'Neill from Beehive Books. The compiler of the new Dracula, The Evidence Project, which I can't wait for him to finish. So on with the show. Let's talk about Chapter 8 of Dracula. And we begin with Mina Murray's journal. It was her journal entries last chapter, all about the Demeter was, from Mina, but it was cuttings from the newspaper, and then and then the logbook, and then a bit about, then a bit from her in the journal at the end. But now we're same day, 11 o'clock p.m. The text says, which means it's August 10th, which is the eve after the funeral of the Demeter captain that she was just at. That was the end of the chapter, the funeral of the captain of the Demeter, and. She hits it 3 times in this passage, right? I believe we should have shocked the new woman with our appetites when they go to lunch. And then towards the end of that paragraph, some of the new women writers, and again, it's in quotation marks. Like Stoker's putting it in quotation marks both times. Writers, some of the new women writers will say will someday start an idea that men and women should be allowed to see each other asleep before proposing or accepting. But I suppose the new woman, and now here it's not in quotation marks, I suppose the new woman won't condescend in future to accept. She will do the proposing herself, and a nice job she will make of it too. There's some consolation in that. Odd, it's the little, like, at the same time, it's Stoker, in a sense, making fun of this whole concept of the new woman, but then Mina, his character, maybe embracing it. What do you guys think of this so much gets made of this mention of the new woman in this novel, and this is it. It's this paragraph is the mention of that phrase. I thought for sure that it came again, and then I looked up and it doesn't. So what do you guys think of this?
Well, 20-year-old Lauren has written, Stoker is afraid of feminists in the side of the page. So I think that she was unimpressed 10 years ago on first reading this, which is amusing to look back to. I always find this bit really interesting because it's, to me, kind of like that Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost moment, where I get the impression that the intention is being a new woman is bad, blah, 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 blah. But what comes off is kind of like, well, actually, Mina and Lucy are even better than that, and you should, you know, be independent and go for walks and eat lots of food and do your own thing. And I do think it's a really interesting, contentious moment where it almost doesn't really make sense. But I agree. I think it's really interesting that this is the only bit that it's actually kind of actively mentioned. But we do talk about it kind of again and again and again. But yeah, I think this is one of the, judging by what I've written in the margin, this is definitely one of the things that made me dislike Stoker the first time I read it.
Gwendolyn, did this kind of thing come up with you the first time reading or coming across it, or did you notice that phrase and wonder what it was?
Yeah, I definitely think I did, but unfortunately, I just kind of chalked it up, like put it in the category of like, oh, here's another thing like this. Because I feel like as a woman reading a lot of literature in general, you tend to be like, oh, look, here's another example of this, and you roll your eyes and you're like, do I stop or do I keep going? And you know, you keep going. And I do like that it's almost like it changes midstream. It goes from being like, oh, the new woman, then to being like, oh, well, I guess there'll probably be some benefits to this whole new woman thing. And so it's almost like Bram Stoker was kind of going back and forth with himself. Certainly Mina seems to be. So, I mean, you can't always project that the author is agreeing with the character. But in this case, I almost feel like, because it's such an aside, it has nothing really to do with the plot. Like, we could take this out and the book would keep going, you know, pretty much unchanged. So I feel like it's this kind of like almost on the page wrestling with these ideas. And I sometimes wonder if authors are doing it for themselves or if they're doing it because they're curious what their readers feel. I'm not sure. I'm never sure if it's like just this inner dialogue, I'm just going to put this out there, or if it's actually like I want to engage with others and kind of test them and see where they're at with it.
Well, here's a question for you as an author, Gwendolyn, especially because, you know, I almost feel through this novel that he's created this character, Mina, who is super smart, and we get lots of patronizing comments from the men about how smart she is. But in a sense, he creates this character who has all these great abilities and is smarter than everybody else. And then I almost feel like she's doing these things and he can't stop her. Like the author himself can't stop her from being this smart and great. And so he has to kind of contain her in a way. And he has a hard time doing it because of the character he's created. Does that happen with you when you create a character? Are they that alive that you may have to control them?
Sometimes I think, yeah. I mean, I actually feel like that's when the work actually comes the most alive, because then it's not just like, oh, I'm just, you know, writing this very, you know, straightforward story. It's that the characters start to take over a little bit and they feel more like living people. And then you kind of have to be like, well, am I going to contain them or am I going to let them kind of go in this direction that they're going and see what happens? And I think it depends on the story for me, whether or not it's like, okay, I got to really reel this in, or just let it go and see what happens, because sometimes that can be really interesting just to see where the character will lead you.
Mary, where are you at on the new woman? My notes, I already talked too much because my notes said Mary, Lauren, and Gwendolyn talk. So there you go. I'm not like really. I mean, I have to guide, but because that's my job. But you know.
I think it's some of the stuff that when I first read this years and years ago, I didn't like Mina. I thought, oh, she's against all this new feminism stuff, and she's just so into Jonathan, and it's really boring and dull. But actually, yeah, you do get like with the second half of this bit where it's almost like she does come to life, and she's like, well, maybe women will do the proposing, and I think you do see that kind of foreshadowing of what will happen just for women in women in society, but also in Gothic and horror, you know, that the woman who will use her own agency and be badass, and that's here in Mina. And I think it's like my recent readings of Dracula where I've been like, actually Mina isn't as bad as I first thought, and it's because of moments like this, not the kind of the first comment, but the later comments. Yeah.
We good? I want to, give this topic enough because, I think that especially how Gwendolyn has taken one of these characters and kind of pulled her out and given her, far more agency than Stoker allows her in the text. This is, and again, I think it's something that happens in the text without Stoker's control, and that Mina is constantly trying to, do her best to guide these sometimes just idiotic, decisions from these vampire hunters. And this phrase, the new woman, is used as, patronizingly in a sense, but then again, that just that last little mention of it for Mina without the quotations, I'm wondering if she's, the character trying to take control of it and saying, yeah, we are new women, and these are the things we are capable of.
Yeah, it's a strange one because it is contentious because, the new woman was imagined, particularly in things like Punch and in cartoons and kind of caricature, as being this kind of unwoman, of being extremely mannish, of being really aggressive. There's a really famous cartoon of the new woman on her bicycle, which Kate Beaton does a really great comic about, and it's actually now, I think it's the cover for her book called Step Aside Pops. It's the kind of like the new woman riding along on her bicycle, like, which I really love. But it kind of reflects back to things, again, to go back to Wilkie Collins, things like The Woman in White. You have two characters, one of whom is, blonde and very feminine and, very sweet and essentially useless because she can't do anything for herself. It's kind of implied that they're so aristocratically inbred that she has no ability, no virality. And then her half-sister is extremely intelligent. She's very forceful. She's the one that kind of saves them both, who drives the narrative.
Yeah, Marion.
And she's kind of described as being, Marion's described as being horrific. She has almost no femininity. She's horrific because of her appearance. And it's kind of, implied that neither of them can have both. They can only have one or the other. And this is really interesting because Lucy and Mina could very easily fall into that archetype of, the blonde, beautiful, kind of fragile Burkean idea of, by Burkean I mean Edmund Burke, who kind of theorized that for women to be beautiful, they had to be a little bit sickly. They couldn't be completely healthy to be beautiful. You had to be just a little bit sickly. She kind of, at first seems to fit into the archetype, and Mina is maybe the more bookish, more intelligent, brunette, this classic trope. But they totally kind of subvert that, and they kind of cast that off to the side. And I think that's why a lot of particularly female readers get really angry about what happens to Lucy. Because in this kind of early portion of the novel, you're like, oh my God, this is so great. It's totally rejecting this trope. It's totally rejecting this kind of convention. It's doing something really radical and really different. But then you have this weird conversation about the new woman, and you have what happens to Lucy, and particularly when she becomes the Blue Lady. And there is this kind of conscious, kind of continuous tension between these ideas of women, where Stoker seems to not quite fully be able to cross that line. He's playing with some really subversive, really radical ideas, but then it has to be reined back kind of at the last moment. Like, Lucy has to die, Mina has to be the secretary, there has to be that masculine triumph. Like, it's a really interesting tension. I don't think there's any resolution, and I couldn't tell you, what do I think is the product of that, but I think it speaks to an ongoing anxiousness about femininity and about that balance between femininity and intelligence and femininity and agency in particular. And I think that's why this novel invites so many radical reinterpretations. Like what Gwendolyn's doing, you can take this novel and kind of give it a really strong feminist narrative, and it doesn't stray from the text. Like, it's still kind of working within the canon, and I think that's something that you don't get with a lot of novels, if that makes sense.
Lee in the chat says, any chance of intense ambivalence from Stoker on new women, that he's comfortable with the idea of professional independence, like the women in the theater that he's, you know, very much in contact with all the time, but is terrified of their sexual independence, which I think we see a lot of, you know, he has trouble with in the text.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you think back to the wives, there's a definite anxiety about female sexuality. I think, yeah, what do you think, Mary?
Voluptuous is his word. Like, we never, you know, they're all voluptuous. And
yeah,
then later with Lucy, that's the only word
so
he can
many
say.
times, that word voluptuous, and that kind of implication of excess, voluptuous equals excess, and excess equals danger. Particularly in the Gothic, excess is the kind of like, the red light comes on, that's the warning sign.
Well, he complicates this even further. Well, he doesn't complicate it. He stresses more of his, you know, problem or his issue with it. And because now that in this next section here, this is 11 August, 3 a.m. So it's the middle of the night, and Mina wakes up and Lucy's gone. So she's sleepwalking. And this is the moment, you know, the moment will happen soon. And then, but there's a lot of focus on her clothes and what she'll wear and what people will think. And this is like the biggest issue for Mina, but I think it's really the biggest issue for Stoker. You know, it struck me that the clothes she wore, this is Mina talking, might give me some clue to her dreaming intention. Dressing gown would mean house. Dress, outside. Dressing gown, which is her nightgown. Dressing gown and dress were both in their places. Thank God, I said to myself, she cannot be far, as she is only in her nightdress. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. And then I feared that Lucy must have gone out as she was. Feared that Lucy must have gone out in her nightdress. There was no time to think of what might happen. A vague, overmastering fear obscured all details. So not that there's a cliff she could walk off, you know, that her biggest fear is that she's in a nightdress and she goes out to, you know, stop her from that. And a little later in the passage, we'll get the shoes and, oh my God, and Mina covers her feet in mud so people don't notice she's walking barefoot, God forbid.
I love that detail. That detail was the one that I just laughed. This chapter in general, because even when we get to Renfield later, I think they talk about what he's wearing. I'm like, they are so concerned with people. I'm like, these Victorians, they were so scared. Oh my gosh, you're going out in your nightgown. I'm like, nightgowns back then are way more clothes than what most of us wear on a day-to-day basis now. So there's this kind of irony that they're like, oh my gosh, it's only a nightgown. I'm like, those nightgowns were so heavy. I've seen vintage nightgowns. They're like way more than a dress is now. So yeah, but there was a huge focus in this chapter on what people were wearing, and especially the girls. I mean, I have to cover my feet. They can't think I'm barefoot. And I'm like, you should be way more concerned that there was like some creature over your friend that you guys have no idea what it was. But it was like, oh my gosh, my bare feet. So yeah, that was I'd forgotten that. That just made me laugh. I'm like, wow. Yeah.
Is this only a scandalous thing for male authors? I mean, you know, and I also think of Woman in White. Wilkie Collins' Woman in White. He's got this great scene where Marion undresses and she takes off all these heavy clothes and all these petticoats she's wearing because she's going to climb out on the roof to eavesdrop on, you know, on the bad guys. And there's almost like this titillation going on in the scene too, because she's undressing and he's describing it. But so it's this weird, like, I'm saying the woman shouldn't be burdened by all these clothes because she could do more things if she's not. But it's also like, you know, a thrill for Wilkie Collins to think about it. And for Stoker, it's clearly, it's a scandalous thing. It's a moral thing for Stoker, for a woman to be seen with, you know, in different kinds.
I think it comes up a lot more in these male authored texts. I'm trying to think, Miriam, you might be able to kind of help me on this. I'm trying to think of any female authored texts that are this concerned with what they're wearing, and nothing really springs to mind. And it seems to be like right from the sensibility novels of the 1740s, like Samuel Richardson and Pamela and Clarissa is obsessed with what they're wearing, which I find ridiculous because they're writing letters and they're like, yes, I wore my like light green and I was wearing a hat, and I wouldn't write that. I don't text Mary and be like, well, I'm going to wear. And I do think in Pamela, she literally sews her letters into her skirt so that Mr. B can't find them. And there is this very kind of heavily sexually coded scene where he's looking for the letters, so he undresses her. But I think it figures a lot more in Melissa. Can you think of anything, Mary?
Nothing comes to mind, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is a more kind of male author type thing. I think for me, what I find really interesting about Lucy, both in terms of her sleepwalking, and the fact that she just goes out in, you know, her nightdress, and even the way that she confesses to Mina, you know, about the proposals, and I wish I could have accepted all three. It's this idea that there's something almost vampiric about her before Dracula kind of enters the scene, and there's something that almost threatens that kind of, you know, propriety, 19th century society, like propriety, and maybe, you know, why does Dracula choose Lucy? And I think it's this kind of thing, because she sleepwalks and she wants to marry 3 men, and she goes out in her nightdress, and
the fact that where Mina finds her is their favorite seat, because that like, on the one hand it's an invasion of the physical space, of the ideological space, of their friendship, but on the other hand it's that kind of symbol of Lucy's independence and her agency, that, you know, she lives this very full life. She's not particularly interested in settling down and being the angel of the house, and I do think that the fact that, you know, she's on that seat, she's in the churchyard, she's gone to that very symbolic place for her and Mina, where they've, you know, been having these conversations. I think that kind of links into what Mary's saying about that vampiricness, that subversiveness of Lucy. You know, what? Because yeah, it's a good plot point, but otherwise, why that spot? Why there? Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense otherwise. Apart from the fact it paints a really great picture. But I think there's more to it than that. I think it's intentional. I think it links into that voluptuousness.
Mm-hmm. Do either of you, Lauren, Mary, do either of you have a Dracula text with you handy, or because I was going to read some, but you want to read some, because now she's looking for, and she mentioned she's a white figure, which again I keep thinking a woman in white. Now, powerful that woman in white image was through that whole second half of the 19th century, and here she's looking for. And you see where it's there was a bright full moon. It's halfway into that paragraph that starts the 11 August 3 a.m. Lucy and I don't, you know, looked, and I don't know where, seeing Lucy in our favorite seat. There was a bright full moon with heavy black driving clouds. You see that, Mary? You see that? Mary, why don't you read?
Okay. So at the edge of the west cliff above the pier, I looked across the harbour to the east cliff in the hope or fear, I don't know which, of seeing Lucy in our favourite seat. There was a bright full moon with heavy black driving clouds, which threw the whole scene into a fleeting diorama of light and shade as they sailed across. For a moment or two, I could see nothing, as the shadow of a cloud obscured St. Mary's Church and all around it. Then, as the cloud passed, I could see the ruins of the abbey coming into view, and as the edge of a narrow band of light, as sharp as a sword cut, moved along, the church and the churchyard became gradually visible. Whatever my expectation was, it was not disappointed, for there, on our favourite seat, the silver light of the moon struck a half-reclining figure, snowy white.
Keep going, a little more.
The coming of the cloud was too quick for me to see much, for shadow shut down on light almost immediately, but it seemed to me as though something dark stood behind the seat where the white figure shone, and bent over it. What it was, whether man or beast, I could not tell. I did not wait to catch another glance, but flew down the steps to the pier and along by the fish market to the bridge, which was the only way to reach the east cliff.
Excellent. So she's seen Lucy, and that's a great passage too. Thank you for reading it. On the bed, and there's another shadow, like, you know, bending over her, and we know what the, you know, who the shadow is. And that image, not only the shadow shut down on light almost immediately, and the way the clouds are covering up the moon. It's this gorgeous image that he's got here to create this. I mean, this is for, you know, for me, this is an example of the novel is a Gothic novel. You know, that we realize that, you know, the Gothic is nobody in the 1890s says that novels are Gothic anymore. Like it's really difficult to come across that in any kind of criticism that anybody ever thinks that we're actually still writing Gothic, and here this imagery shows up. And then even words like the town seemed as dead, you know, just to kind of reinforce the mood that's going on here. Gwendol, do you have a book too? Were you reading along there?
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to read some?
Sure.
Just from there, or yeah, from there to the end of that paragraph.
Okay. The town seemed as dead, for not a soul did I see. I rejoiced that it was so, for I wanted no witness of poor Lucy's condition. The time and distance seemed endless, and my knees trembled and my breath came labored as I toiled up the endless steps to the abbey. I must have gone fast, and yet it seemed to me as if my feet were weighted with lead, and as though every joint in my body were rusty. When I got almost to the top, I could see the seat and the white figure, for I was now close enough to distinguish it even through the spells of shadow. There was undoubtedly something long and black bending over the half-reclining white figure. I called in fright, "Lucy, Lucy!" And something raised a head, and from where I was, I could see a white face and red gleaming eyes. Lucy did not answer, and I ran on to the entrance of the churchyard. As I entered, the church was between me and the seat, and for a minute or so I lost sight of her. When I came in view again, the cloud had passed, and the moonlight struck so brilliantly that I could see Lucy half reclining with her head lying over the back of the seat. She was quite alone, and there was not a sign of any living thing about.
Ooh, so good. And spells of shadow. Like I was trying to come up with a drink, and I was like, spells of shadow. That should be that's a great name to you, and such a great phrase for him to use. I have to look that up and then see if he grabbed that from somewhere. It's a gorgeous little phrase. But the red gleaming eyes, the white face and red gleaming eyes. So Dracula is on the scene. And his two red eyes, which will come up again, throughout this chapter, this emphasis on his two red eyes, which we've seen. The first time was the carriage rider, right? He's got the two red eyes, and then does he describe them when Jonathan's in the castle? I can't remember.
I think it's when don't the girls pass him in the street?
Yeah.
I think it's the last chapter. There's a bit about passing a figure with red eyes.
That must be the next chapter. We get that. What do you mean when Jonathan sees him in the street, young? That's not yet.
I feel like there is a moment where someone passes Dracula in the street, and you get that description of the red eyes.
But he's got these red eyes. Do you want to read a little, Lauren, too? That next paragraph there, at the beginning of that, when I bent over her.
When I bent over her, I could see that she was still asleep. Her lips were parted and she was breathing, not softly as usual with her, but in long, heavy gasps, as though striving to get her lungs full at every breath. As I came closer, she put up her hand in her sleep and pulled the collar of her nightdress close around her throat. While she did so, there came a little shudder through her, as though she felt the cold. I flung the warm shawl over her and drew the edges tight round her neck, for I dreaded lest she should get some deadly chill from the night air, unclad as she was. I feared to wake her all at once, so in order to have my hands free to help her, I fastened the shawl at her throat with a big safety pin. But I must have been clumsy in my anxiety and pinched or pricked her with it, for by and by, when her breathing became quieter, she put her hand up to her throat again and moaned.
We'll
when I had carefully wrapped up my... sorry.
Well, we could read the whole chapter.
Yeah.
I would love to do, but you know, moaned is a good word to stop on. Because it's like we have this, you know, we have symptoms of, you know, of the post-bite symptoms: gasping for air, shudder, moaning. In a little bit, I think when you guys get up, she's like trance, or there she is. She's trance-like there, and there's something very post-coital about it too, isn't there? I mean, is it just me? I mean, with the shudder and the moaning, and again, it's, you know, I mean, Stoker denies it later that, you know, it's not sexual, but come on, it is, you know. And I wonder though, because I wonder if he really believes that he's not writing about sex when he's writing about, you know, vampires, a vampire's attack, because he is.
I always find that interesting in a lot of Victorian era, you know, Gothic literature, just literature in general, when you just really get this feeling that it's like they don't know that they're writing about sex, that they're like denying it even to themselves on some level, and it's like, that's kind of sexual. It's very sexual. But yeah, this scene, I'd forgotten how sexual it was. I feel like when I was younger, maybe I missed that, even though it's like, I think somebody actually wrote it's not even subtext, it's just there. I think somebody wrote that in the chat at one point. But like when I was younger, sometimes I wouldn't catch things like that. And then you go back later and you're like, oh my, like how did I miss that?
Yes, and well, we missed it because we weren't thinking that.
It's very basic. Yeah, I think it is very sexual, but it's also very, like, it is essentially a rape. But is it? Like, you have that, from Mina's perspective, it's an assault. You know, Lucy has been lured out, she's being attacked. Mina finds her in this state of undress, of distress. She seems to be in pain, she can't breathe. But then, because we don't get it from Lucy's perspective, there is that ambiguity there. And I do think that's really fascinating, that you could read it as a moment of very distressing sexual assault, or you could read it as a very erotic kind of moment, or you could read it as both. And I think that is really interesting, that even though there is this denial that it's about sex, it is about sex, but it's about that complexity and that uncertainty of the erotic of sex. And I think that's one of the things that I find really fascinating about this. And the fact that, you know, Lucy keeps waking up in the night and things like that, and, you know, she is unclad. Mina wraps the shawl around her, gives her her shoes, that kind of thing. So there is that kind of suggestion of a bodily invasion of some kind.
This is the monster for it. This is the monster that does that. You know, this monster doesn't just tear you apart, or you know, it's not just, you know, a beating. It is it is, you know, a violation. They, you know, they go inside you. There's penetration, whether it's teeth or not. There's a penetration, and there's a fluid exchange, and it is, you know, when I used to teach vampire lit, we would go through all this, you know, and the students are very attuned to this. You know, it was very kind of titillating to them. It was very exciting, all this erotic exchange with vampires, and then it would just gradually dawn on them that it's also assault, or it is assault. Maybe not even also, maybe it is assault. And it really comes to play when they finally attack and destroy, you know, and when they stake her, that it becomes this horrific assault on her. And the dawning realization I used to get from students over the course of this was always very interesting to see. And yeah, and we have it here, but it's simultaneous. It's odd because, you know, there are times when I really enjoy this kind of eroticism in vampires, and then I have to take a step back and feel guilty about enjoying this, because am I enjoying assault? And is it the artists who are creating this stuff who are making me do that, or is that in me? And like all horror, that really makes us come to grips with these things inside us that we don't generally, you know, have to deal with in life, or I hope we don't have to deal with in life. So that didn't need to be a stop talking moment there.
Well, I was going to say, Mary.
Lucy being under his thrall, kind of. And I think that's something really interesting that you can look into, ideas of consent around rape and sexual assault. I mean, obviously now we have, well, there's drugs and date rape drugs, but here you have a kind of invasion, kind of subtle invasion of Lucy's will, of Lucy's subconscious, and that kind of focus on the eyes as well. So I think there was in one of the previous chapters the mention of the basilisk eyes, and that idea of the eyes being really important to vampires in that kind of thrall and that kind of moment. So I think, yeah, this moment is important to look at those subtleties, and it makes us uncomfortable, and I think it should make us uncomfortable. This is a monster, and you know, we should sit with that and see where, you know, where it takes us. But yeah, that's definitely there, that kind of assault.
And he is a monster, and in spite of all the adaptations that make him not a monster, in this novel, he's a monster. He is, there's not much redeeming about him. And I say not much because he has like a line here and a line there that like throw a little bit, you know, of complexity to him. But, you know, Dracula in this novel is a beast and described as that. But with a text like this and with a character like this, we have these, you know, we have a century of, you know, adaptations and, you know, just the way, you know, he comes through culture to us. And he's just, it's hard to read a text naked anymore, you know, from then. It's, you read it with all the Draculas, and you read it with Christopher Lee, who is certainly a beast in his movies, but he's so goddamn sexy. And, you know, it's like, and it's hard to get past that but so it's all, this text is so great to read. You know, there's so much here that I forget is here. But we'll move on, because again, we get more mentions of anxiety about Lucy, reputation, you know, worried about the story, worried about her sleepwalking even. That story might become distorted and it would leak out. And then the next day, same day, noon, she looks better this morning than she has done for weeks. She actually looks great after getting bit. And that makes me think of the consumption thing, the images of consumptive patients, people with tuberculosis in the 19th century, and how they would get this like gorgeous flush to their cheeks and their eyes would be bright, and that very romantic image of, and whether or not it's even true, it's so hard to figure out if it's true, because that's the way people wrote about described how these patients looked as they're, you know, wasting away inside.
And that links back to that beauty thing that I was talking about as well. Like Edinburgh in the mid 18th century writes the sublime and the beautiful, that so much of the Gothic takes its kind of cues from. But this kind of like this semi-consumptive image of women, this kind of like, there's something beautiful in a slight sickness, and I think he says something like, you know, a woman's never more beautiful than with like a touch of illness in her cheek.
It's the Poe quote, the legitimate
like
Poe
a woman
quote.
who's too hearty. Yeah, like, and I think that's really interesting, that, you know, she's been kind of pallid, she's been kind of, you know, unwell, and that all of a sudden she's flush and she's, you know, seems lively, and it's kind of playing with that idea of, you know, the fragile female beauty in this kind of potentially post-coital moment. You know, it's kind of that like age-old trope of like the morning after glow. Like that's essentially what's happening to Lucy right now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, more of the post-coital, but the Poe quote is when he was writing about the Raven, the death of a beautiful woman is the most poetical concept, the most poetical theme. But it's something that Poe writes over and over about, and also because he's spent his whole life looking at beautiful young women dying, and he was usually in love. And if you were a woman and you were in love with Poe, you're gonna die. So because they all did, one after the other throughout his life. and no wonder this becomes the chief image for him in poetry. And but it's across the spectrum in the way people treat with, you know, consumption or just illness in general in the 19th century, and this
even earlier.
Yeah.
Like 1750s, you have like things like Clarissa, where she's basically entombed already. She's like lying on her deathbed, and they're like, oh, she's never looked more beautiful, like she's so close to God right now. And she's essentially in the outfit she's picked to be buried in, and she's just lying there choosing to die. And they're all like, this is the most beautiful creature I've ever seen in my entire life. And it's meant to be really moving, but it's absolutely horrifying.
We'll have this fascinating twist on that later, because with Lucy, then they're horrified by how alive she looks, and then when she looks dead and peaceful, they're like, oh, now she's beautiful, you know. And I'm certain she didn't look more beautiful dead. You know, so 12 August, we're like, she's spinning along here, a little paragraph for every day here. You know, twice during the night, I was awakened by Lucy trying to get out, but she doesn't. And all her old gaiety of manner seemed to have come back. And she came, oh, and I love this beautiful little passage. And she came and snuggled in beside me. Like Stoker uses snuggled. I love that. She came and snuggled in beside me and told me all about Arthur. I told her how anxious I was about Jonathan, and then she tried to comfort me. Well, she succeeded somewhat, for though sympathy can't alter facts, it can help to make them more bearable. First, it's a lovely little passage of these two friends and the intimacy that they share. That is a really good thing about this novel. But you know, at the end of the day, it's like, be patient, girls. You know, like, really, that's what they're told. Just be patient, will you? And people are sick of being patient. I mean, this is the world today, right? People are sick of being patient, you know, which is a good thing. But to wrap up this, though, it's, you know, because I want to get to Lucy's, you know, description of her attack. The next night, August 13th, I woke in the night and found Lucy sitting up in bed, still asleep, pointing to the window. Between me and the moonlight flitted a great bat, and that bat is Dracula, coming and going in great whirling circles. Once or twice it came quite close, but was, I suppose, frightened at seeing me, and flitted away across the harbor towards the abbey. When I came back from the window, Lucy had laid down again and was sleeping peacefully. She did not stir again all night. Now, I keep saying, you know, the figure, it's Dracula, he's biting her, this bat's Dracula, but Stoker doesn't do that. That he's really creating effect, especially for his earliest readers, that this is that it's very mysterious as to what's going on here. He doesn't completely spell it out. And you're a first reader, and it's a bat. It's a bat for a first reader. It's not Dracula. The bat is associated with vampires, and clearly vampire bats are called that because of vampires. It has been, I see images, I see even notes sometimes in books that Dracula is, you know, where we get the bat image from, and it's not. We actually get it from Varney the vampire. Is where I think the first time the bat becomes associated with the vampire. Although it was the animal even before then, because the bat drank blood, so they called it a vampire bat. She's also got, and one of the things that I jumped over, I think I did, didn't I? I did, because Lucy talks about, or Mina talks about, the safety pin had hurt her. She thinks that she's cut her neck. The skin of her throat was pierced. I must have pinched up a piece of loose skin and have transfixed it. Really, you stuck a pin through her throat, and like, that makes sense. For there were two little red points like pinpricks, and on the band of her nightdress was a drop of blood. And I wanted to bring that up too. The wound on the neck is another, we have another signal here that it was a vampire. And that goes back to, I think it goes back to Polidori. I don't think, and as he's the first vampire in English fiction, I mean, that's the appropriate place to start. But the Greek girl Ianthe, who Aubrey is with, she gets attacked by Lord Riven, and then she has a wound on her neck, and I think that is the first time, because in folklore, while vampires suck blood in folklore, and we get that, and people talk about being throttled sometimes in vampire folklore, that's one of the things the vampire does, comes and throttles them. So there is some kind of neck associated with that, but there's no, in folklore, vampires don't bite you on the neck, or at least no one's written about it. And Emily Gerard didn't write about it, where Stoker got a lot of his info as well. I also wonder, I wonder if it's a stage tradition. I wonder if stage vampires bit women on the neck. Either of you know? Is that, or any of you know? Do we get the wound on the neck from Polidori? I can't think of any other source, and it happens in Varney too. But
yeah, Mary, you do more work on blood than I do.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like you say, in folklore, there's not really that kind of biting or necessarily even blood. I think some of the folkloric accounts, it's the animals have been infected, and then the kind of villagers have eaten these infected animals, and that's how they've been turned. So there isn't necessarily that direct human to human transmission. But I always go back to Shylock. You know, if you call me dog, beware my fangs. And one of the texts that I look at, it's not a supernatural vampire, but it's a character called Mr. Vampire, in a book called Marchmont, by Charlotte Smith, written in 1796, I think. And he is a lawyer who quotes Shylock and quotes that specific line, you know, call me dog and beware my fangs. So I think that idea, I think it in you know, it is present on stage through Shylock. And again, Stoker would have been aware of the Merchant of Venice, because Henry Irving played Shylock, and he was a massive fan and groupie and friend. But yeah, I'm not sure. I think, I mean, why would there need to be fangs? I guess it does seem to be more of a visual signifier than a kind of practicality thing that you find in folklore.
And I
so
think
by way of Shylock, I would say.
Yeah, Carmela, she bites like the chest, doesn't she? It's like under Laura's collar.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think.
I mean, the neck is
anything else.
The neck is such a sensual place, and it is a place that people already do. You know, I'm sure it's just not a modern, you know, thing where people kiss each other on the neck and even bite each other on the neck. I'm sure hickeys go back, you know, thousands of years. But it's already a place where, you know, that is associated with, you know, erotic pleasure.
It's also definitely a thing in the Gothic of like a female vulnerability. So you get a lot of these images of lots of descriptions of Gothic heroines whose necks are very graceful. And I don't know if it's just because it's, you know, the only part of the body exposed, but you get all of these heroines who have these like long, pale white alabaster necks. And there's like, I think it's Adeline in Romance of the Forest, she's fainted, and the Marquis like, oh, look at her neck. And there's all of these kind of moments of like this weird sort of tender vulnerability that's associated with like women's throats. And I wonder if maybe that's where it's kind of coming from in terms of a Gothic tradition, that there's this kind of already long-standing obsession with necks and throats. But it does definitely crop up this description of, you know, like people being entranced by the throats of these young women, which when you kind of read the descriptions, you kind of just go, yeah, okay, and then you come back to them and you're like, wait, what? Like, there's lots of these kind of, like, her long swan-like neck, which in actual fact would be really unattractive. You definitely do get it kind of going right back to the 1780s, this kind of, like,
you know, the décolletage and the throat being this sort of very sensual, very, very vulnerable part of a woman, essentially. And I do wonder if maybe it's kind of coming from that, as well as the theatricality of the vampire bending over and biting.
Yeah, and it's Stoker's text that even if it showed up in text in Polidori here and there, it's Stoker's text that solidifies it for everyone. I mean, not only because it's so popular, but because he goes. And there was also, you know, Dracula cuts himself and has Mina drink there later, but the neck becomes the focus for this novel, and that influences all vampires, you know, since then. I love the moment in Near Dark where Bill Paxton is going to bite the guy on the neck, and he's kind of like unshaved, and he's like, "Oh, why do they always have to be unshaved?" And you know. But this is I want to share a page of the notes and talk a little bit about that. This is Book 2, Chapter 3. Now, this is originally where what Stoker was thinking about for this chapter, and I won't obviously make you, you know, try to decipher it yourself. I have the thing here, but it's Chapter 3, and it is Book 2, Chapter 3, and it's letters, Lucy and Mina, and then Whitby, and then he's got Mina. He's got Mina dream, walks in sleep, and then he's crossed it all out, okay? And he's written Lucy's dream. Finds strange brooch on shore and puts it on. This is a detail that he took out, that he originally wanted to explain away this pin, give Mina a real thing to explain away the pinprick. Now, later then he just uses it's a safety pin on the cloak that did it, but he originally had it as a brooch, and I wonder if this was going to have some kind of deeper significance, this brooch that she finds on the shore, and puts it on. She becomes fond of dreaming and walks in sleep. Here's the brooch on shore. She becomes fond of dreaming and walks in sleep, renewing old habit. And then he has Lucy's dream. Mina wakes suddenly and misses her. Like Lucy was, so perhaps his original conception was to describe Lucy having a dream before then she goes out. So there is in his mind perhaps this psychic connection between Dracula and Lucy. But Mina wakes suddenly and misses her, goes in pursuit, sees something white, something dark in moonlight in old churchyard on cliff, seems like man, then wolf, then seems to fly. Oh, I love that, you know, and he didn't go into all that. It's just this figure, shadow, and then he's gone, you know, after the moonlight goes away, and then he's gone. But originally it was seems like man, then wolf, then seems to fly, follows, finds Mina in sleep on bench. And now it seems that either he hasn't crossed this out or he's just mixed up in his head now, Mina and Lucy, like which character is he using here? But he wrote, finds Mina in sleep on bench, wound in throat and brooch covered with blood. And then in quotation marks, I must have, at the bottom here, I must have pricked myself in my sleep putting it on. So this is his conception of how this is his first conception, and then he's crossed it off here, like he's done with this. And I imagine he's gone through and he knows that at some point when he's dealt with these scenes, no matter how much he's changed them, he crosses them out. But love the little details in here. And then this brooch that's covered in blood, and is this going to come into play somehow? Is this some kind of, you know, magical item or something in a way? Maybe it was the brooch that Dracula left on the beach that then Lucy found, and that enabled him to connect with her. All little details that he doesn't play up, but I love the image of man, then wolf, then seems to fly. I would definitely have used that. That's what I would have done. Were I Stoker, were I a genius writer, I would have used that one. So, and the notes are filled with that. There's so many little details that he abandons, and then, you know, does something different, often better. But before we get to Lucy's little piece here, the red eyes, I did, and I missed this earlier. I think it was from Tucker, Tucker Christine, who's one of our co-hosts. He wrote about the Poe quote. Actually, that Poe quote was used as the intro to Nightmare on Elm Street, credited to Poe. That's why it has come down. It's because Nightmare, and Tucker's got this big Nightmare Freddy collection. So he's the one that knew. It is. That's
Nightmare on Elm Street's fault now. And now we know, because it's so we thought it might be the internet that did it, because I've seen the internet do that, but it goes way back. This is apocryphal from way back.
Nightmare 3, like in Poe's, they give a Poe quote to it, and they say Poe said it, and so everybody now believes it. So that's fun. 14 August. Boy, do I love this passage. Because this has. You rarely get this in vampire fiction up to this point, where the person who is attacked describes in this kind of detail what the attack was like. And his red eyes again. Why don't you read it? Gwendolyn, why don't you read that? His red eyes again.
His red eyes again. They are just the same. It was such an odd expression coming apropos of nothing that it quite startled me. I slewed round a little so as to see Lucy well without seeming to stare at her, and saw that she was in a half-dreamy state with an odd look on her face that I could not quite make out, so I said nothing, but followed her eyes. She appeared to be looking over at our own seat, whereupon was a dark figure seated alone. I was a little startled myself, for it seemed for an instant as if the stranger had great eyes like burning flames, but a second look dispelled the illusion.
All right, I got it wrong there. That wasn't that's not the passage that we were looking for. That is her again with red eyes.
Yeah.
And the windows of St. Mary's Church, the way it reflects and the red sunlight comes through. We're going to get that passage in a minute, and I'll have you read that. But but that red eyes in the sunset, and Dacre Stoker told me, I don't know if because you guys have been to Whitby, Dacre Stoker said that is a real effect that happens when the sunset comes down and it reflects on those windows at St. Mary's Church, and it kind of gives the effect of the red eyes. And the wondering is that something that Bram Stoker saw when he was there, and then obviously puts it in the novel, but it leads him to emphasize these two red eyes. That's like this kind of natural phenomenon that happens, and that he uses it to reinforce Dracula. Have you guys ever seen it?
I've never seen it at St. Mary's. It's definitely something that happens.
Yeah.
Most churches with stained glass are built so that at certain times of the day, the same refracts in a certain way.
I'm sorry, you jumped in and out there, your video feed.
So Whitby, you've got stuff like Revo and what are the other ones called? Byford Abbey? I can't remember there's like 5 or 6 abbeys in that part of Yorkshire, most of which are just completely ruined now, apart from Revo. But they were almost all situated in places where they would have a specific kind of natural effect. I can't remember the name of the one that I visited, which is really bad, but Revo is kind of like down, almost, you kind of come up a hill and then it's slightly down, so that you get this effect if you go at the right time of day where the mist hangs around it, which is almost definitely intentional. But yeah, a lot of stained glass was built specifically to refract at a certain type of day. You did a project though on Whitby and Whitby Abbey, Mary.
Yeah, when I went to Whitby, it was 3 days, or kind of 2 days split over 3 days, because we had to travel there and travel back. And I didn't know about this whole red eyes thing, so that's something for me to go back and look. But again, I
have to go again.
I guess we
I looked up pictures, and a lot of people take images of this kind of red sunset coming through the ruins of the Abbey. But this particular effect is apparently with St. Mary's, because the sunlight hits those windows, and then they're kind of bright for a little bit, just the sun hitting them as it's going down. And Dacre wasn't the only one who was seeing this. I've read other people that have seen this.
I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case, because it's where it's situated. I mean, I was thinking about the bit where Mina talks about her feet. I feel like that every time I climb up to Whitby Abbey.
I didn't mention that earlier because Mina's race to get her. Someone in the chat mentioned it a few weeks ago who's done that. And Dacre said he did that he did the run from where they would be all the way down the steps up to, and
it's a long distance.
Yeah, it's like a mile. Yeah, I'm totally having a heart attack. There's no way I'm making that run.
You're looking across from one cliff to the other, but to get there you have to go down, go like across the street, I don't know, like 10-15 minutes, cross a bridge to the other side, then come all the way back, and then you have 199 steps to climb. So that moment between when Mina sees Lucy from across the cliffs to kind of running down, running to the bridge, running across the bridge, then running back again, and then up all those steps, easily could have taken 10, 20, 30 minutes.
And like Robin Hood's Bay is the same. You don't really get this, but the fact that they visit Robin Hood Bay is like on the way there, it's flat land, like it's moors as you can see. And when there's a storm or when the mist sets in, you can't see anything. It's dangerous and people get lost out there all the time. But when you're at Robin Hood Bay, you have to go up. The town is at the top, and then to actually get onto the bay, you have to go all the way back down, and then to get back up again, you have to climb up these stairs. So all these places that they visit are quite treacherous. Like they're not easy walks or easy climbs. Like the landscape that you're looking at when you're looking at these places is really something. I mean, I've driven to Robin Hood's Bay before, and there's been like mist or fog, and I've literally been driving thinking, this is how I die. Like I'm not gonna come out the other side of this, and no one's ever gonna find me. I'm just gonna be on the moors, like haunting for the rest of my life.
The black dog. Yeah.
It's beautiful, but it is quite it's quite oppressive as a landscape. That climb. The only one that's worst is the one at Castleton, which Scott's Peril of the Peak is based on, which Mary and I have had to visit twice for work. And climbing up it is just so intense that you get to the top and you're like, can't breathe. That climb, the fact that she runs, I think you're supposed to get something from that, because as much as I love Mary, if I saw her across the cliff, I'd be like, oof.
Yeah.
I'm not got the right shoes on.
I know, like if Mina sees her and then she's gotten if that was me, it would have been like she would have been drained by the time I got there. Like there's no interrupting that. Up those last few steps, I collapse. Hello, and he would have had all night to drain her if I was.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you, Lauren.
But the yes, Mary, you're done. Don't count on Lauren to save you. If there's a long distance in between.
Yeah, I mean, if I can't drive there in a car.
Yeah. But anyway, after they have this, they see these red eyes again. This is again the second attack, and Mina's coming home, and Lucy's already home. And she sees her. I glance up at our window and saw Lucy's head leaning out. I thought that perhaps she was looking out for me, so I opened my handkerchief and waved it. She did not notice or make any movement whatever. Just then, the moonlight crept around an angle of the building and the light fell on the window. There distinctly was Lucy with her head lying up against the side of the windowsill and her eyes shut. She was fast asleep, and by her, seated on the windowsill, was something that looked like a good-sized bird. And then she runs into the house, and she comes up and she sees her, and she has her hand on her throat as though to protect it from the cold. So I love this detail because Dracula's feeding on her as a bat in his bat form, and he's not in the house. I don't have to be invited in. I'll get you to stick your head out, and then I'll feed on you there. Again, which is the kind of details that Stoker puts in that he doesn't explain later. Van Helsing doesn't then learn this and say, oh, well, see, Dracula wasn't invited into the house yet. And so you as a reader will later put this together, but right now you don't know what's going on. We know because we've read it 1,000 times. Apologies for all the spoilers to the people who are reading it for the first time, because this is what happens. And so here's the second attack, and then she is paler than is her wont, and there is a drawn, haggard look under her eyes, which I do not like. I fear she is fretting about something. I wish I could find out what it is. And the next day, Lucy was languid and tired and slept on after we had been called. So now we're really having the effects. After the second feeding, she's really been drained, and she's starting to, either die or become a vampire or both. Stoker doesn't describe this, process, and he doesn't give out the exact rules of how to make someone, a vampire, but he's slowly feeding on her. He doesn't want to drain her yet. Or Mina keeps interrupting him. Like, maybe she was going to be drained completely the first time. Maybe she was going to be drained right then as a bat. But Mina keeps interrupting this attack, so it has to happen, piecemeal. And then this is also the moment where Mina finds out that Lucy's mother has a heart condition, and and she could die at any moment. Any shock could kill her. But what I find interesting here is that this is the first instance of, and this will happen several times in a novel, where something is kept secret from other characters, and usually that doesn't work out well in the end, keeping secret. I don't know if it saves her mother in the end, but there's a secret and we're not supposed to talk about it. People are always prevented from knowing everything about someone or a situation here. So
one thing I do find really interesting about the entries on the 15th and the 17th is the repeated use of the word languid.
Yeah, and the 17th especially, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because languish is one of those, so increasingly in the 19th century, you get these discourses about kind of aristocracy and interbreeding and the failure of bloodlines, and, there's anxieties about things like masturbation and about virility and vitality, and languid is one of the words that comes up again and again and again, and languishing. This kind of, there's nothing obviously wrong, and languid is it's used in Collins, it's used in, I think, in Cabinet of Caligari, it's used in quite a lot of kind of mid-19th century stuff, this kind of almost like decaying from the inside, and often it's linked to things like aristocracy, and there's lots of anxiety about, like I say, masturbation and about the loss, unnecessary, the kind of laziness, and it's like this culmination. I think the fact that you get languid not once but twice is really poignant.
And I just looked it up. He uses it 4 times total, and not as much as voluptuous, but still, a word that keeps coming back to him as he's trying to describe this condition.
And in particular, Lucy, I think there's something. If someone hasn't looked, I suspect someone has, but if someone hasn't looked into this from like a sort of medical humanity,
what's that?
Or that idea of languishing and languid is really, I think it really stands out.
Can you repeat that? We just lost you for that last.
Oh, sorry. We're on the verge of a thunderstorm, and I think it's taking a hit on my internet connection.
So if you go out, that's what it is. Okay.
If I go, it's the thunderstorm.
Don't blank out. We're not going to worry too much.
I keep looking outside and thinking, please just wait like another hour.
Mary's not going to run to save you, though.
She's like an hour away.
Definitely not running.
We're good friends, but, she's not going to run down the M1 for me, unfortunately. Just the fact that this repetition of languid and this that brings to mind that image of languishing, ability, I think from a medical perspective.
And I just looked it up, and Seward uses it later, languid, but I think he's describing Mina and then it's used about Mina again later. So it's used twice here for Lucy, and then it'll be wind up using twice for Mina. but so on the 17th, not only is she languid, but then she's noticing the rest of her condition. And last night I found her leaning out again from the window. So this is the third time now that Dracula is feeding on her. When I tried to wake her up, I could not. She was in a faint. She cried silently between long, painful struggles for breath. And then the wounds, she sees the wounds on her neck. They are still open, and if anything, larger than before, and the edges of them are faintly white. They are like little white dots with red centers. Unless they heal within a day or two, I shall insist on the doctor seeing about them. So, so he's still feeding on her without coming into the house, which is smart, Dracula. He doesn't have to be invited in to feed on Lucy, at least. He can get her to lean out the window. And this shortness of breath too is really interesting that Stoker makes as a symptom, that gasping for air after she's been attacked. Next, we get these two curious letters. Well, they're not curious because they're the letters about the Carters and about the boxes being Dracula's boxes of earth being transported. Now, part of that is, you know, we need to, it's the detail for the plot that we want to know. This is especially in the first letter. And also, keep in mind that if you're reading it for the umpteenth time, you probably realize Dracula's in one of the boxes. And he gets taken to, this is how he gets to Carfax, that he's taken in one of the boxes and he's there. And we find this out later with Seward and Renfield. But the boxes get taken. But I love this second letter, and I used to wonder why it was there. Like, why do you need a second letter saying, okay, we've accomplished this? Like, you could just assume that it's accomplished from the first letter. And also this, because it's so short, and it's really a receipt, this letter. We beg to acknowledge 10 pounds received and return check, 1 pound, 17 shillings, 9 pence, amount of overplus. I love the detail of that, and this is something I've mentioned several times, that Stoker really loves to give us these mundane details to really ground this novel in everyday regular life, which will then make the supernatural that much creepier because it's everyday things are happening around it. And so Dracula's moved the boxes and himself covertly. And this is on the 17th is this letter, and they're going to leave at 9:30 at night on the 17th and get there at 4:30 on the 18th, okay? And so here's Mina writing on the 18th, and they're sitting in the churchyard, and Lucy is much better because last night she slept well all night. Why did she sleep well all night? Because Dracula didn't come and feed her because he's in a box on the way to Carfax. She's in gay spirits. She's full of life, cheerfulness. She's doing great. And then we get this is where we get the passage where she recalls her bite. So Gwendolyn, why don't you read this? I didn't quite dream, and read that whole paragraph.
Where's that at? Oh, there we go. Okay, I got it. I didn't quite dream, but it all seemed to be real. I only wanted to be here in this spot. I don't know why, for I was afraid of something. I don't know what. I remember, though I suppose I was asleep, passing through the streets and over the bridge. A fish leaped as I went by, and I leaned over to look at it, and I heard a lot of dogs howling. The whole town seemed as if it must be full of dogs howling all at once, and I went up the steps. Then I had a vague memory of something long and dark with red eyes, just as we saw in the sunset, and something very sweet and very bitter all around me at once. And then I seemed sinking into deep green water, and there was a singing in my ears, as I have heard there is to drowning men. And then everything seemed passing away from me. My soul seemed to go out from my body and float about the air. I seem to remember that once the West Lighthouse was right under me, and then there was a sort of agonizing feeling as if I were in an earthquake, and I came back and found you shaking my body. I saw you do it before I felt you.
Gwendolyn, you first. What do you think about that? That is the description of Lucy gives of her experience being bitten by Dracula.
there's something about the fish detail that I love, and I don't even really like, you could leave it out, but I just love it. I love, like you said, this grounding in reality, this thing that's not necessarily relevant to everything, but I love that she like stops and looks at this fish, and then she hears the dogs howling, which I love the dogs.
And she's sleepwalking. So that's like while in a trance, it's almost like she's hyper, like everything's coming in to clarity while she's walking in her sleep, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I love that. That's like sticks out for me. The fish and the dogs howling are just like my favorite part of that passage. And I do like that then this idea that she feels like she's floating and then kind of pulled back into herself. So that's a great, like, it's an interesting idea as to what exactly Dracula is doing to her. It's not just, this attack. It's this kind of much more supernatural experience, that it's like she's being kind of transported out of herself, and almost like a drug. I mean, a lot of this, like you said, the hyper awareness, this sounds like being on drugs.
This sounds exactly like a drug. I mean, this sounds exactly like I've read some descriptions of heroin, and the experience of the rush when you're on, and then that out of body experience, and that happens. And I don't know if this is being bit by a vampire, like, sign me up, like, right? Like, doesn't this sound good? Mary, what do you think of this one?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. You get a kind of separation between the soul and the body. And I think that's really important for the way that vampires are portrayed in this novel, that the kind of, it's almost like the vampires you get in Buffy, where there's like a demon inhabiting the flesh body, but your soul is something separate. And I think here you do get that kind of separation of Lucy's soul as it's leaving her body, as Dracula or something demonic and vampiric is inhabiting her kind of her flesh body, in a way. Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Lauren, anything to add on this?
The only thing really, I guess, is that image of sinking into the deep green water, that there's this kind of implication that as he's feeding on her, she's maybe becoming a part of him through that experience, which is something that you get a lot in vampire narratives. And I think the green stands out to me a lot because that is a colour that we often, by trope, associate with evil. But also, I may have mentioned this last time, I talk about it pretty much all the time, Paul Verval's La Vie Vampire, or Vampire City, which is basically Anne Radcliffe fan fiction.
Yeah.
The vampires in that are horrifying. And the way that they work is that when the vampire makes other vampires or makes vampire thralls, they become one, like, homogenous thing. And they can, like, shift out of each other and they can change shape. But they are described as having this kind of, like, greenish energy, or like a green, like, that colour is very heavily associated. And just this image of Lucy kind of sinking into something and sinking into this kind of deep green water, I think kind of speaks to that idea of the consumption. And particularly after Dracula, we start to get vampire narratives where the creator is a really important thing. There's like the vampire prime, and then all the vampire spawn that he makes, and things like True Blood pick up on this. I think this passage kind of hints at that and speaks to that in a really interesting way, that she's having that out-of-body experience that suggests transformation and suggests something supernatural is about to happen, but then Mina disrupts it and interrupts it.
Yeah. Mina's always, interrupting these, moments with
Mina's like the anti-supernatural. She's like the sort of, which I guess is like, the full realization of the Gothic heroine. Like, she's supposed to be like a beacon of the Enlightenment femininity. She's meant to be rational and reasonable and resist the supernatural superstition. And Mina physically does that because she keeps interrupting these supernatural moments. Like, no, I will not allow this to happen.
He's a good friend.
Yeah.
That's what she is. So, excellent. So, all righty. I want to get to Renfield before we go today, but so we because you always want to get to Renfield, and but Mina finally gets the letter from Sister Agatha. I love that Sister Agatha, in a way, shows up in the new BBC Dracula. That Sister Agatha writes her a letter that Jonathan took. He's got brain fever, because that's what you got in the 19th century. You got brain fever when you were frightened beyond your wits. And she also writes, he has had some fearful shock. So says our doctor. And in his delirium, his ravings have been dreadful, of wolves and poison and blood, of ghosts and demons. And I fear to say of what? Like, did he say vampires? And Sister Agatha doesn't want to say that. I also like the insertion of poison in there, that's something that is in Jonathan's mind, that he has been poisoned in a way, that a vampire attack poisons you. But Mina's going to go off and, and then there's a little joke that when he was like, when he rushes into the station out of his mind, seeing from his violent demeanor that he was English, they gave him a ticket for the furthest station. So, thank you. Got an ice delivery, so it's gotten rather warm in here, and all my ice is melted in my drink. So, thank you, Sophie. So I got an ice delivery. Yes, he's English. That's why he's so crazy. That's what they think of the Englishmen out here in other countries. And they set him on a train, and Mina's going to go to him, and that's next chapter, because now we get Dr. Seward. Back to Dr. Seward's diary, 19 August, strange and sudden change in Renfield last night. So this is 19 August he's writing this. Last night was 18 August. That's when Dracula has arrived at Carfax in a box. And not just Lucy, but Renfield too seems to have this, psychic connection with Dracula, that when he is around, people who sleepwalk, are attracted to him, or people who are crazy, insane, have some kind of mental disability are attracted to him. Renfield says, all he would say was, I don't want to talk to you. You don't count now. The master is at hand. I love that. And they also, there's a bit here about, he's a strong man with, what they learn is he's a strong man with homicidal and religious mania. For a strong man with homicidal and religious mania at once might be dangerous. The combination is a dreadful one. That if you are homicidal and you have religious mania, you will be dangerous. Yes, I would assume that is, the history of humans, that we know that is true. But Renfield he's asked about his pets, and I love that he calls them that. I lead him to talk of his pets, the spiders and flies, and bother them all. I don't care a pin about them. And then he has this gorgeous line here that sounds like a biblical quote and is not. The bride maidens rejoice the eyes that wait the coming of the bride. But when the bride draweth nigh, then the maidens shine not to the eyes that are filled. I guess that I'm trying to take that apart. Are the bride maidens, is that him or is that the flies and spiders that await the coming of the bride? When the bride draweth near, the maidens. Yes, so the bridesmaids are literally his flies and spiders, that they don't matter anymore once the bride is in his presence. And isn't that a great image of Dracula as the bride coming to Renfield? That is the imagery that Stoker uses as Dracula.
Yeah, I actually saw a stage adaptation recently. Well, no, maybe about a year ago. It wasn't great. But one of the things that they did do was had Renfield as female. And I think they could have done more with it, but they mostly gave the character the same lines and the same role, apart from towards the end when they did something quite different, which I won't talk about now because it will spoil the end of the novel for those that are reading along. But it was really interesting, the flip of the dynamic with the things that Renfield says and does coming from a female character. And things like this, you know, the bridemaiden, the master is at hand, flipping that to a female character was a really strange dynamic, but it worked really, really well. It added, I don't think it necessarily added a layer that's not there, but it emphasized some of the stuff that perhaps we miss when we don't take in those aspects. Like having it come from a female character rather than a male kind of highlighted some of the kind of undertones of the things that Renfield says. And I think stuff like that, like it worked, that part of the adaptation worked really, really well. And it definitely has made me think differently about it reading it this time.
Is this image here, just as Dracula's a bride, is this a way of kind of queering the text in a sense, is looking at it this way? You know, see Dracula's a bride, yeah. And Renfield's the groom then, right?
Yeah, like I think there's a definite queer reading of this, and I think that the way that it's weird, by making it a female character, it kind of unqueered it, but it reinforced to me, in a strange roundabout way, seeing Renfield as female reinforced to me that there is a queer reading here, because it's the same lines, and I don't really see that changing the gender necessarily changes the intention behind them. And I think a lot of the things that Renfield says about Dracula you can read in that way, and that kind of that horrific doubling and mirroring with Lucy, and that idea that being in the vampire's thrall is in some way sexual. I think that's something that we can really read into, particularly this scene where he's agitated and he's excited and he's not interested in his pets anymore, and you know, he's using the imagery of weddings and kind of, you know, brides.
He calls him a bride.
Yeah, like, you know,
Dracula's my bride. Is my bride.
Yeah, or that kind of, there's that kind of giddiness in some of these scenes that I think maybe we pass over if we read Renfield solely through the kind of lens of the asylum and insanity and degeneracy. We miss some of that queering, I think, perhaps.
And he puts it into this form too, where it seems like a biblical text, and it's not. But I don't want to get into that at the end here when more of that comes back, and especially when I ask Mary about this. So, you know, this kind of religious context that's being given to this vampire here. But first, I promised people drug use in this chapter last week, and there actually isn't, because it's just a hint of it. It's Seward talks about taking drugs, the chloral, the modern Morpheus. I'm not going to read the chemical compound there, because he says, I must be careful not to let it grow into a habit, which means that he is taking this drug. No, I shall take none tonight. So I've thought of Lucy, and I shall not dishonor her by mixing the two. So chivalrous. I'm not going to get loaded because I'm thinking about Lucy. And then later that night, Renfield has escaped. The window is wrenched out, and Renfield goes through, and Seward crosses over and to the grounds of Carfax, which is right next door to the asylum, conveniently.
Yeah.
And then on the far side of the house, I found him pressed close against the old iron-bound oak door of the chapel. So the chapel is where, you know, he runs to. He was talking apparently to someone. And then when Seward gets closer, he hears him say, I am here to do your bidding, master. And the your is capitalized in the text. So he's talking to a god. I'm here to do your, or a mega superior. I'm here to do your bidding, master. I am your slave, and you will reward me, for I shall be faithful. I have worshipped you long and afar off. Now that you are near, I await your commands, and you will not pass me by. Will you, dear master, in your distribution of good things? And then Seward comments on, oh, he's thinking of the loaves and the fishes, and ha ha ha, he doesn't understand that real religious people focus on the miracle part, not on what they're getting from the miracle, well, give me the loaves and fishes. But that, and then he's a wild beast, the paroxysm of rage. They have to put him in a waistcoat and chained to a wall in the padded room. His cries are at times awful, but the silences that follow are more deadly still, for he means murder in every turn and movement. So this is the combination of the homicidal and religious mania, at least this is the way Stewart sees it. And then he says, I shall be patient, master. It is coming, coming, coming. The end of this chapter, Dracula's coming is for Renfield. He's God. He's being visited by his God that he has apparently worshipped long and from afar off. Mary, especially want to ask you with your work in religion and the Gothic. Here we get it. We get the vampire and religion married, right? And married, which was the bride imagery.
Yeah, and I mean that image of the bridegroom and the bride is very biblical, and it's very much associated with Jesus. So I think there's a bit where John the Baptist talks about Jesus in as a bridegroom, and there's also a bit I think
Solomon, isn't there? In the Song of Solomon, there's something about that too, right?
Yeah. And specifically in the New Testament, in the Gospels, you get this idea of, I think someone asks Jesus, why aren't your disciples fasting? And he says, well, because I'm here, but when I'm gone, they'll fast because they'll wait for the wedding. And the wedding is seen as the return, when Jesus will come back, the second coming. And I think it's really interesting in the kind of pastiche of biblical imagery that Renfield uses, in that he does talk about the bride maiden, and Dracula is like a kind of inverse Christ figure, but he's feminized, and I think you get that later with Mina. Not to give too much away, but the way that she drinks Dracula's blood, it's very much like breastfeeding. I think that's really interesting. You do get the whole, master, and the capitalization of you and your and him, and it's very, very much a kind of subversion of that way that we talk about Christianity and within that kind of Messiah that will return. And here you have it. It's coming. He's here. That idea of resurrection and return. So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Renfield's thing is basically the blood is the life, right, Mary?
The blood is the life, which is
Get that soon. I think that's
and Leviticus. Yeah. It's really, I find it really fascinating within vampire narratives, because if you look at the biblical verses in the Hebrew Bible, it's a prohibition against drinking and eating blood, because the blood is the life. So you don't do that because it's precious, because it's the life. But vampirism, and especially, in this text, it's like a inversion of that. Because the blood is the life, that's why we consume. Deuteronomy and Leviticus, I can't remember the verses, but where they
we have an awesome people following the chat here. They're like popping like
I can see all the
Bible quotes all through it. I love this. We have such a great crowd here. They're all over this too. So I'll send all three of you guys the chat so you can read through it, because it's so much fun during the show. So Gwendolyn, there's I don't think any religious imagery in your Lucy Westenra story, but is this something that you wind up using in horror? Do you ever use this in horror?
Like religion and horror?
The religious mania, or just these as a thematic concept in horror?
Occasionally. That's not a huge thing for me. I see that in other people's work, and obviously Mary studies it extensively from everything that you're saying. So it's like, that's not a place that, I do a lot with, but it definitely kind of gets in there. I feel like religion is so omnipresent in every culture. So it's definitely something that that's there. I think it's just, it has to be on some level because we all live in this world, so it's there all the time. One other thing I want to point out that I did really love, because I always love repetition in literature, especially in fiction, because I think of it as being so poetic. I love that Renfield says, "It is coming, coming, coming." So he says it 3 times. And in Mina's journal entry, I think the last one for this section, she says, "Joy, joy, joy." And so I love that there's this, it starts with her saying joy 3 times, and it's like, it's so great, Jonathan's okay, it's all good. And then Renfield has the repetition of with coming. So it's like, you know, maybe there's joy for this moment, but it's obviously not going to last. I like that. I like that little detail.
That's so interesting, because joy is very much associated with that kind of salvation that Christ brings. And then, I mean, 3 is always a powerful number anyway. You've got the witching hour, but in those kinds of passion narratives, you know, 3 days between when Jesus dies and he's resurrected, and then you have the story with Peter where you know, the cock will crow 3 times, and you will deny that you know me 3 times. So that's really significant, and I think it's interesting here that Renfield is pastiching that kind of religious narrative. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Well, most important for 3 times is Candyman, 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 to see if I get a visit today. So
yeah, or Bloody Mary.
Bloody Mary,
Bloody Mary
that's
is 3
another
times. Yeah. So
yeah.
all righty. Well, thank you all. And what a great show today. Gwendolyn, it's been a pleasure to have you here. Dracuphiles, thank you all for tuning in today, for watching this program on replay, if that's what you're doing. We will post this recording on our website. If you know, for people who can't sit the whole 2+ hours, and we have a Sundays with Dracula Facebook group where we can continue the conversation. So if you haven't already, I know many of you have, look us up on Facebook, join in the conversation there. There's always a lot of fun stuff going on in the weeks between programs. I am always available also to answer questions by email. Send me your questions. I will get back to you. I know sometimes it's a couple days, but I do get back to everybody. Next week's co-host joining me will be editor, author, curator, publisher Josh O'Neill. That'll be great fun to have Josh back on the show. And don't forget, Leslie Klinger will be here next week. So that will be a lot of fun as well. If you're looking for more virtual engagement in our quarantine world, head on over to the Rosenbach website. Check out all the virtual offerings we have. If you would like to make a donation to the Rosenbach so we can continue to create programs and courses inspired by our magnificent collections, just go to that website, click on the support tab. I would be more grateful than Renfield when he realized the master was at hand. So, Lauren and Mary, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us back. Yeah.
Good. You're always, I always want you back. People keep asking too, like, can they come back? Can they come back? No offense to my other co-hosts, but they ask if you come back. So, so we'll see you again in a few weeks, which is good because you're done grading now. Like, you're done marking. You're totally free now. So
yeah, we're not busy people ever at all, really.
All righty. Gwendolyn.
Thank you so much.
Gwendolyn Geist, thank you so much for coming today. Everybody, if you haven't read her story already, read it. Get her other novels. I'm certainly absolutely, going to read your other work now. That your story was so fabulous. And if anybody out there, because I used to teach vampire lit in my university professor days. But if you teach vampire lit, you should absolutely be teaching this story that she wrote as part of your Dracula unit. I think it's a perfect thing. So people should do that. Join us next week on Sundays with Dracula for Chapter 9 for a wedding, more fly eating, and the entrance of Peter Cushing. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's Dr. Abraham Van Helsing will finally show up in the text. Once again, will be played out by Tucker Christine's Pleaded Gazelle song, Storm at Whitby. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Farewell, everyone. And in the words of our friend Dracula, go safely and leave something of the happiness you bring. Farewell.